Welcome back to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and this week we're bringing you our 5-part adaptation of The Final Problem, one of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's best-known stories featuring the great detective Sherlock Holmes. In part 2 of our program, Holmes has taken shelter in his friend Dr. Watson's medical consulting rooms, where he is explaining the reason behind his odd behavior and bloody knuckles. Holmes has set himself against Professor Moriarty, a brilliant academic who secretly controls a vast and pervasive criminal network responsible for nearly all of the serious crime committed in London. Holmes has taken steps to dismantle Moriarty's network, but has exposed himself to terrible danger in the process. As we rejoin the story, Holmes continues to explain Moriarty's organization to Watson, along with the steps he has taken to destroy it. I could hardly believe what my friend was telling me. A Napoleon of crime? A vast criminal network encompassing London that had never once in all its nefarious dealings been revealed to the authorities? It seemed hardly possible. And yet, here was my friend before me, his eyes wild and nervous in a way I'd never seen before. I pressed him for more details. How can it be that this Moriarty has never fallen under suspicion? Have you taken steps against him yourself?
The professor is fenced round with safeguards so cunningly devised that, do what I would, it seemed impossible to acquire evidence which would convict him in a court of law. You know my powers, my dear Watson, and yet, at the end of 3 months, I was forced to confess that I had at last met an antagonist who was my intellectual equal. My horror at his crimes was lost in my admiration at his skill. But at last he made a slip, only a little slip, but it was more than he could afford when I was so close upon him. I had my chance, and starting from that point, I have woven my net round him until now it is ready to close. In 3 days, that is to say, next Monday, my trap will be sprung, and the professor, with all the principal members of his gang, will be in the hands of the police. Then will come the greatest criminal trial of the century, the clearing up of over 40 mysteries and the noose for all of them. But if we move at all prematurely, you understand, they may slip out of our hands even at the last moment. Now, if I could have done this without the knowledge of Professor Moriarty, all would have been well, but he was too wily for that. He saw every step I took to draw my net around him. Again and again he strove to break away, but I headed him off. I tell you, my friends, that if a detailed account of our silent conflict would have been written, it would take its place as the most brilliant bit of cat and mouse work in the history of detection. Never have I risen to such height, and never have I been so hard-pressed by an opponent. He cut deep, and yet I undercut him. This morning the last steps were taken, and 3 days more were all that was needed to complete the business. I was sitting in my room thinking the matter over when the door opened and Professor Moriarty stood before me.
Holmes is a man of hardened nerves, but he could not help but confess that he felt a thrill go through him when he saw the very man who had been so much in his thoughts standing there on the threshold. Moriarty's appearance was quite familiar to Holmes. He was extremely tall and thin, his forehead domed outward in a white curve, and his 2 eyes deeply sunken in his head. He was clean-shaven, pale and ascetic-looking, retaining something of the professor in his features. His shoulders were rounded as if from much study, and his face protruded forward, slowly oscillating from side to side in a curiously reptilian fashion. He peered at Holmes with great curiosity in his puckered eyes. A long moment passed between them before Moriarty spoke first.
You have less frontal development than I should have expected. I must warn you, Mr. Holmes, it is a dangerous habit to finger loaded firearms in the pocket of one's dressing gown.
The fact is that upon the moment of Moriarty's entrance, Holmes had instantly recognized the extreme personal danger he was facing. He understood that Moriarty's only conceivable escape from justice lay in silencing the detective's tongue. In an instant, Holmes had slipped his revolver from a drawer into his pocket and kept the barrel pointed at Moriarty from beneath the cloth. At the doctor's remark, however, he withdrew the weapon and laid it cocked upon the table beside him. Moriarty still smiled and blinked, but there was something about his eyes which made Holmes feel very glad to have the weapon there beside him.
You evidently don't know me.
On the contrary, I think it is fairly evident that I do. Pray, take a chair. I can spare you 5 minutes if you have anything to say.
All that I have to say has already crossed your mind.
Then possibly my answer has already crossed yours.
You stand fast?
Absolutely.
He clapped his hand into his pocket, and Holmes raised a pistol from the table. But Moriarty merely drew out a memorandum book in which he had scribbled some dates.
You crossed my path on the 4th of January. On the 23rd, you incommoded me. By the middle of February, I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March, I was absolutely hampered in my plans, and now, at the close of April, I find myself placed in such a position through your continual persecution that I am in positive danger of losing my liberty. The situation is becoming an impossible one.
Have you any suggestion to make?
You must drop it, Mr. Holmes. You really must.
After Monday.
I'm quite sure that a man of your intelligence will see that there can be but one outcome to this affair. It is necessary that you should withdraw. You have worked things in such a fashion that we have only one resource left. It has been an intellectual treat to me to see the way in which you have grappled with this affair, and I say, unaffectedly, that it would be a grief to me to be forced to take any extreme measure. You smile, sir, but I assure you that it really would.
Danger is part of my trade.
That is not danger. It is inevitable destruction. You stand in the way not merely of an individual, but of a mighty organization, the full extent of which you, with all your cleverness, have not yet realized. You must stand clear, Mr. Holmes, or be trodden underfoot.
Holmes rose to his feet.
I am afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance which awaits me elsewhere.
Moriarty rose as well and looked at Holmes in silence, shaking his head sadly.
Well, it seems a pity, but I have done what I could. I know every move of your game. You can do nothing before Monday. It has been a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. You hope to place me in the dock. I tell you, that will never stand in the dock. You hope to beat me. I tell you that you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much to you.
You have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty. Let me pay you one in return when I say that if I were assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interest of the public, cheerfully accept the latter.
I can promise you the one, but not the other.
Thus snarling, Moriarty turned his rounded back upon my friend and went peering and blinking out of the room. My friend, sitting before me in the safety of my consulting room, sighed deeply as he came to the end of his account.
That was my singular interview with Professor Moriarty. I confess that it left an unpleasant effect upon my mind. His soft, precise fashion of speech leaves a conviction of sincerity far more disquieting than shouted threats. Of course, you will say, why not take police precautions against him? The reason is that I am well convinced that the blow will come from one of his paid agents. I've had more than enough proof of this already.
You have already been assaulted?
My dear Watson, Professor Moriarty is not a man who lets the grass grow under his feet. I went out at midday to attend some business in Oxford Street. As I passed the corner, a two-horse carriage, furiously driven, was on me like a flash. I jumped for the sidewalk and saved myself by a fraction of a second. I kept to the pavement after that, Watson, but as I walked down Vere Street, a brick came down from the roof of one of the houses and shattered to fragments at my feet. I called the police and have had the place examined.
What did they find?
There were slates and bricks piled up on the roof for some repairs, and the police would have me believe that the wind blew one of them off on the street below. The wind! Of course, I knew better, but I could prove nothing. I took a cab after that and reached my brother's apartment in Pall Mall, where I spent the day. Now I've come to you, and on my way I was attacked by a ruffian with a bludgeon. I knocked him down. The police have him in custody. I can tell you with absolute confidence that no possible connection will ever be traced between the gentleman upon whose front teeth I cut my knuckles and Professor Moriarty, who was, I dare say, working out problems on a blackboard 10 miles away at the time. You'll understand now, Watson, why my first action on entering your rooms was to close the shutters, and the reason why I am now compelled to ask your permission to leave the house by some less conspicuous exit than the front door.
Sherlock Holmes has pitted himself against his most dangerous enemy yet, the brilliant Professor Moriarty, a villainous mastermind, the controller of a vast criminal network behind almost every major outrage in London. Holmes has thrown himself into battle with this nemesis, and through 3 months of exhausting work, during which he engaged Moriarty in a hair-raising game of intellectual chess, the great detective has finally set his trap. The bulk of the work is already done, but Holmes has exposed himself to terrible personal danger. Join us again tomorrow as Holmes and Watson go on the run for their lives in Part 3 of The Final Problem.